Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Come Say Hi podcast, where we talk about topics such as resiliency, AI, tech, life, and ancient history. Today's guest is Peter, aka Enigma Seeker. He has a YouTube channel with over 10,000 members, and I am very excited to have him with us. I'll pass the mic to you, Peter. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi Netta, thanks. I've known Netta for a while, on Twitter Spaces, so that's kind of how we met up, with people like Third Eye, Seeks, and others talk about ancient history. So I ran across Netta and Third Eye by learning about Atlantis and kind of challenging some people on the spaces about the topic because I have studied landscape architecture from Iowa State University and political philosophy at University of Iowa. So I got interested in the topic of Atlantis, and I realized there's a lot of new age stuff out there, and there's also the mainstream archaeological record. But I'm kind of someone in the middle that I do agree there really was a place, and I'll be happy to elaborate more about that. So yeah, I have a YouTube channel, and I also explore topics of like ufology, since I'm consider myself an eyewitness of the second kind. So, but we won't get too much into UFOs. Since James Cameron was really into ancient history as well, like Atlantis,
Mm-hmm.
he did a documentary I think called Atlantis Rising with another producer. So I ran across his videos, and of course, Disney's Atlantis. So I was into, I like watching that when that movie came out, Disney. I really liked that, but at the same time, that's when I was starting to think maybe Atlantis is North America, but you got can't take Hollywood too seriously. But then I ran across on the Japanese side an anime called Nadia Secrets of Blue Water, and that director named Hideki Anno, he
Mm-hmm.
put it back in Africa, and I found that interesting. And I'm like, maybe it has something to do with Africa. So ever since then, especially when I started studying landscape architecture, I learned about garden history and started learning about ancient Persian gardens and the origins of gardens. And then when you read Plato in detail, you realize he's talking about something that's almost like the Garden of Eden, a paradise. And then when you go back to that history, you start to realize it kind of all camel routes, I guess you could say, not all roads, but all camel routes and sailboats go back to Egypt. And the hypothesis that I'm presenting, based off other researchers like Jake Gwen Griffiths, is that Egypt is 100% the island of Atlantis. And there's a lot of nuance there, and it's a little complicated for people who take things too literal in Plato, just like Christian evangelicals will go by sola scriptura. Well, New Age people like Jimmy from Bright Inside and Dan the Debunker and Graham Hancock and many others, they also have a sola scriptura attitude when reading Plato. But for example, 9,000 years before Solon. Well, some historians have argued there is definitely some error going on with that, and actually should be 900 years. If that's correct, now we can start to fit it to the historical record. Now it starts to fit with a lot of mainstream archaeology. But at the same time, these mainstream archaeologists, like or historians like Dr. David Miano, he's on Twitter a lot. He doesn't acknowledge the researchers that in Europe that have studied Atlantis and figured out that had something to do with Egypt. That Egypt may truly be Atlantis, the island paradise oasis, a garden of Eden in a sea of sand across the Mediterranean, which at one time, apparently, according to Solon, not Solon, Homer and Stesichorus and other Greek poets, they associated the Mediterranean as the Atlantic Sea. So this is where all this conflation comes about. And it's a complicated topic, but there's some movie producers. I think there's one that came out recently, Jack Kelly's documentary called Atlantis Puzzle or the Atlantis Puzzle. He found one of my researchers that I found, George Sarantites. And Sarantites figured out that, yeah, the Pillars of Hercules had nothing to do with the Straits of Gibraltar at 700
Mm-hmm.
BC. So it actually has something to do with the Aegean Sea. And then that they cross that sea, and there's this mysterious big continent. So imagine you're the Greeks, and you're all of a sudden you land in this paradise garden like the Nile Delta. Of course, that's going to inspire Greek stories.
Okay, let's take a few steps back.
It's a mouthful. Yeah.
Oh, yes, I can tell. So I'm trying to make this as easily digestible as possible for our audience. And I know for a fact that yourself, including Third Eye, that I wish was on this episode, on this recording, like when you both talk about Atlantis, like I know how passionate you are. Let's kind of like unravel this mystery and slash story together. Let's try to simplify it. So I know where your interest lies. I know how your interest in ancient history happened. You kind of connected the dots with James Cameron, with a few folks on X that are using this that have different perspectives, and you mentioned that you are certain that it started with Atlantis is Egypt. Now,
That's
how
according,
can we
yeah, I want to make it
do?
clear that that's not my hypothesis. That's definitely a hypothesis by an author, Egyptologist named J. Gwen Griffiths, in his book
Mhm.
Atlantis and Egypt. And we'll share a picture of that. And this book has an essay of only 24 pages, and it's very concise and detailed and straight to the point, and presenting, for example, things like he mentions elephants, so it must have something to do with Africa. So that's where me and Third Eye agree that it has definitely something to do with Africa because it does mention elephants, and it even also says it doesn't rain in Atlantis. So there are definitely clues that we both agree that it has something to do with Egypt or at least Africa. And I think Third Eye's community is more towards maybe the Rikat structure, which is also Jack Kelly's kind of leaning right now. I might talk with him hopefully. Um, but yeah, that's we're in agreement that it definitely goes back to Africa. Of course, that's problematic to a lot of people.
Okay. So Africa, the weather, the elephants. What are the things have you uncovered or were mentioned in that book that you and Third Eye agreed on?
Well, for example, I mean, we agreed that Atlantis had to have an advanced civilization and that there has to be megaliths. And what's so strange is that people seem to ignore the elephant in the room, but they also get conflated by simple little details like is it 9,000 or is it 900? And I think Third Eye's community was leaning towards, the Younger Dryas hypothesis and Africa. So I'm glad that people like in the New Age community, like Jimmy from Bright Insight, has put it back in Africa. That really helps. But the problem is his very narrow hypothesis is just a Ricat structure. And as someone who studied landscape architecture and some basic geology, I can't agree that it has something to do with the Ricat structure. Randall Carlson doesn't agree. Graham Hancock doesn't even agree. Um, Robert Schoch, a geologist, he doesn't agree. So, but what everybody seems to agree is that Egypt seems relatively more advanced than any civilization in the Middle East for its time, and something really sparked that. They somehow had that knowledge to move 1,000-ton obelisk. So I'm thinking, okay, that if Plato's saying there are megalithic temples in the land of Atlantis and it's an island, then why are we not asking the question, is Egypt Atlantis? Because this goes back to the idea of the garden and, what is a garden? When you read Plato's Timaeus and Critias, he emphasizes more about the landscape, not about the round city, which comes from more likely Persian influence. So
Mm,
it's a connection, it's amalgamation that basically to the Greeks, anything that wasn't the Greek world order of Europa is Atlantis. So that's where people think, well, then you're just saying Atlantis is basically the Middle East. Yeah, the continent. And it has something to do with the Persians, but the pre Persians. So that would be like the Hittites. They were the first real empire in Anatolia, and Plato mentions about a major war happening. So we know another story that connects to that, and that's the Trojan Wars. They sometimes call them the Asua rebellions of the Hittites, and this is in the west coast of Turkey. So it starts to go back to Turkey. So to the Greeks, when they encountered the Turks, they saw them,
mhm.
they were similar to Egypt. So they're like, we'll just kind of call all of this Atlantis, but the island is very specific to referencing Egypt. And I think that's where the conflation comes out. It's a little more confusing, but it's Plato is trying to put a political bias against the Persians because the big bad Persians are gonna out get them. And he because it's clear he references round cities, and people forget, most Americans don't know that Iran has ancient round cities. One's called Darabagur, another one's called Gore, there's Ecbatana, and then there's Susa. And Herodotus speaks about these cities, and they're round. They're perfect. Some of them are perfectly circular with water moats, and they're like a palace kind of circular moat city, about 1 to 1 or 1.5 miles in diameter. So that is probably where Plato's getting the conflation from Herodotus about circular cities, but he's putting that circular city literally in the land of the island. And the island is, we think island means literally in the ocean, but it can refer to an oasis. And that's what people don't have that nuance to figure out, that Plato is looking at the Sahara and seeing that as like an ocean. And all of a sudden there's this green ribbon, and he says Atlantis is elongated. Um, and that green ribbon is a paradise. And that word paradise comes from Persia, paradosia, and it's very clear what that means. In most garden history classes, they teach it's a very clear idea of a juxtaposition between desert and controlled green space where a kingdom is controlling.
Interesting. One of the first things that comes to my mind, and I'm sure it does probably for other people, is Atlantis and the Little Mermaid and the Under the Sea. Um,
Oh, let me bring something up.
how?
That's actually interesting you brought that
Yes.
up, because I didn't think there was any connection to that, but it actually connects back to this idea of the trident. So the trident is idea of a pitchfork used for fishing, and Poseidon holds it.
Hmm.
Now Plato makes it clear that Poseidon is in the land of Atlantis and Athena is in the land of the Greeks. So he's distinguishing that Poseidon symbolizes this Triton region. Like the land was called Tritanus to Herodotus, I believe. And Tritanus was referred to a region that had a lake. And they said this lake also had a connection to a river. So I'm thinking, well, what major river did Herodotus visit? Okay, and there's only one big one, and that's the Nile. And when you look at the delta, it has a forked prong protrusion with at least two or three rivers, maybe three at one time, but at least two branches that come off the main head snake of the Nile, and that represents the forked tongue of a snake. So the trident is associated with like a snake, but also a pitchfork, and there's a correlation between that. So Egypt literally looks like a trident, sort of. There's a symbolic depiction to that when you look at the Nile Delta. So that's where the Greeks are getting the motif of the trident, but also the Hittites literally created tritons for fishing, and they were the ones to invent bronze. The Egyptians and the Hittites really used bronze, and they used pitchforks for weapons and for fishing. So that's most of those artifacts are found in Turkey and um, the Palestinian region as well. So they're not really found in Greece, but Greece adopted that technology as they discovered the Hittites and the Egyptians.
Would you look at that? Are there any other what's the word? Um, Misconceptions about Atlantis that, you've come across in your research, Peter?
Well, yeah, a lot. I mean, I don't blame the 18th century writers exactly, because, at the time they didn't have Chat GPT, they didn't have Google Earth, they didn't have the right translations of Timaeus and Critias. Right now, to this very day, there's some mistranslations on dimensions, like or numbering, like 9,000 versus 900, because of Mycenaean character for 100 1000 are very similar. So some monk in France probably got it wrong when he wrote it down. It's like, I'm not sure, is it 1000 or 100, or you got it wrong. So ever since then it's been recopied and there's errors. So it's same thing with the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules. Nobody really knew which pillars they're referring to. Some is referred to the Black Sea near Istanbul. When it goes into the Black Sea, that could be called the Straits of Hercules. But over time, that place name got moved more and more as colonists were exploring. So when Christopher Columbus came to America, the first islands he named were Antilles. Antilles. I think it's a Portuguese or Spanish for Atlantis. It's a short name.
Really?
And he was looking for Atlantis kind of secretly, but he wasn't too big on it. but he wanted to name the first islands the Antilles because he thought it was, oh, look, it's tropical, it's a paradise, sort of, even though it was really hell to them. Uh, but yeah, so that ever since then, Ignatius Donnelly knew about that connection to North and South America and Central America. Sorry, that people just
That's
started
okay.
thinking that Atlantis is just North and South America, or maybe it's in the literal Atlantic, but most historians and archaeologists would never agree because there's no islands there unless you appeal to Randall Carlson's hypothesis that the Azores is Atlantis. But there's a misconception there because there's no elephants on the Azores and it rains there. So Plato says it doesn't rain and there's elephants. And he also says, literally, he says there's Atlantis hosts the most ferocious animal in the land. So I'm thinking, oh, Africa has some ferocious animals like the lion, the hippo. I mean, hippos are pretty ferocious. So he must be referring to the animals of Africa, not the Azores. So Randall Carlson, he just ignores this detail. So there are specific details that certain researchers will just cherry pick and only focus on that, but they ignore the fact that Plato says it doesn't rain in Atlantis and the waters have a tendency from coming below, hence a well, a spring. He literally says there are springs in the land of Atlantis, and guess what? Egypt has springs. So does the Greeks, but the Greeks don't have elephants and it rains in Greece. So you have to be able to categorize all the elements and details, and that's what the author J. Gwen Griffiths has done. And other authors like J.M. Allen realized that there was a connection with the Persians to some degree. More than likely, it's actually the Hittites, the precursors really to the Persians and the Syrians. So he connected to that because Plato literally says there was 1,200 warships, something like that, and they invaded. Well, the Greeks claimed they were the ones being invaded by the Atlanteans, but it might have been vice versa. So there's some bias, political bias going on, possibly because there's geopolitics involved. So most historians will say, well, there's only one major event we know the Greeks constantly repeated, and that was the Trojan Wars. Now, historians don't call it that; they call it the Asur rebellions. But there was definitely a fight between the Hittites and the Greeks and the Egyptians. So Plato is saying that the Hittites are also part of Atlantis, but they're not the island. So he's conflating multiple things in the Middle East and but emphasizing that there's definitely an island. And it literally and he also says it faces the sea to the north. So the delta, the Nile Delta, is like an island
The
paradise
Delta Nile.
oasis that faces the Mediterranean. And at that time, it was originally called the Atlantic Sea. That's what people don't understand.
That was mind blowing.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's. I'm making
Oh
claim after
wow.
claim, but ultimately, I will share some of these books here. But I realize there's a connection between other legends in ancient history, especially the ones that wrote a lot, and the ones that wrote a lot were the Greeks and the Hebrews, and the Hebrews
Wait,
talk
what were
about
the air
Genesis.
quotes about? What were the air quotes for?
Well, to emphasize
They
that
write? Do they write or they write?
it was mainly the Greeks and the Hebrews who started writing on papyrus in mass. And they started having a bunch of
Mm,
stories around the year 1000 BC to 300 BC. That's when all these papyruses started popping up. And just so happens the Bible or Genesis also speaks about this paradise and that there's
mm,
some banishment happening and there's a destruction. And when you read, the problem is most evangelicals, they take it so damn literal, it's just like you can't rationalize with them. But if you talk to a scholar might say, okay, you have Genesis, and the beginning of it is very simple and simplified to for kids to understand, and it's a basic creation story. But then when you continue to read, it starts to elaborate more and more and more until you get to the Exodus. So the
okay.
banishment in the Garden of Eden is the simplified version, symbolic version to represent the Exodus. That's what I would hypothesize through the documentary hypothesis that says that all these stories in Genesis or in the Bible, the Old Testament specifically, are most of them are fragments of an original event. And we only have one major destructive event that would have triggered a lot of these stories, and that's the Santorini eruption. But the problem is James Cameron's like, well, okay, if there's a connection with Santorini, with the Exodus and Atlantis, but he's thinking that the destruction of the island happened in near Santorini. But no, because Plato says there's elephants. So, but when you read the priest of Sais, actually is saying the destruction happened in the homeland of the Greeks, but it also affected the Egyptians with a flood. So there must have been a tsunami or something. And that is where we're getting the story of the Exodus and the Great Flood. The hypothesis is that they're basically the same event, fragmented by different Jewish tribes or Hebrew tribes, Philistines, whoever, and they just didn't. They were scattered, and they're all trying to compile it around the year 1000 BC. So that's why
Okay.
most secular scholars don't look at the Bible as a chronological thing. And most Catholics, they look at more symbolic with some history, but they don't look at it as this is history, page one, page two, page three. That's not how you really look at it. And same thing with the Quran. Most secular Muslims, they understand that you don't take it so chronological. And I think in the Quran, it's set up in surahs, they call it, I believe. And
Yes.
there's I
AKA
think
chapters.
18, or yeah, were there 18 of them? Oh, I can't remember, but they separate them out, and it's not meant to be in the chronological order that we think. There is some chronology to match the Hebrew Bible, but it's not meant to be taken so literal, and that's the problem with a lot of evangelical Christians or evangelical Muslims. I don't know what they call themselves, evangelical, but literalists. Okay, sola scriptura. You can't have that attitude when you're trying to interpret these ancient writings. It's not that simple. People want to simplify it, but Plato, not Plato, but people make mistakes in writings. Okay, is it 9,000 or is it 900? And 900 makes a lot more sense because now we can connect it back to Santorini. Now, I do agree that there's some date inconsistencies that Third Eye Seeks has brought up, especially on the dating of the pyramids. And I agree. I'm starting to lean. I think he also kind of agrees that maybe we're not saying Egypt is like 9,000 BC, but there's a possibility that some of the dates that they've dated and carbon dated might be off by a few hundred years. And that is what Dr. David Rao in his book Exodus, Myth and History points out, is that there's something wrong with the chronology of the Exodus. It doesn't match up with the biblical literal dates of 1400 BC. But if you shift the timeline by a few hundred years, 200 years, you bring it back to the hard date of Santorini. Now all these stories start to make sense. So there really was a destruction of Atlantis, but it didn't just affect Egypt. It definitely affected the Greeks, and it definitely affected the Hittites, and affected Babylon as well. And this, they call this the Bronze Age collapse. But the modern archaeologists want to keep that date around 1200 BC. The problem is
Why do you
they're
think?
well, because
Why do
they're
you think
finding
they're doing that?
artifacts, like they're dating the artifacts, and there are thousands of artifacts. With
Hmm.
each artifact, there's a margin of error of at least 100 years, plus or minus 50 years on each side or more. So
Hmm.
they're taking that medium date, or they're taking the more conservative date, but they know about Santorini. Like Dr. David Rao knows about Santorini, but he knows that they're going to have to shift all of Egypt's timeline. But if they shift Egypt's timeline, then they're going to have to shift the Hittites' timeline. But there's a chance that archaeologists have gotten these dates wrong by a few hundred years, and I wouldn't rule that out as someone. I'm not an anthropologist. I've studied anthropology. I've studied political philosophy, and architecture, landscape architecture, and I would have to agree that there's something not right with some of these dates. And third, I point out the case of like the Dixon relic of the pyramids, which was rediscovered I think 3 years ago, and they redated this wood artifact and carbon dated it, and they found it was like 3200 BC. Okay, well that contradicts the current date of the pyramid's construction. So some in his community hypothesize, like Matt from Ancient Architects thinks that maybe Khufu did make the pyramid, but his date needs to be pushed back a little bit, or he simply expanded the pyramid or re-restorated it, and that may be the case. Um, but the destruction actually, the actual destruction of Atlantis is not some far ancient story that goes back to the Younger Dryas. I know people like Dan the Debunker wants to believe in the Ice Age stuff, and I used to fall for that, and I just didn't find any logical evidence in that. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there might have been a lost civilization millions of years ago. Okay, if you want to look for
Right.
little carbon remnants in the art in the geological record, sure, like the PETM, Pleistocene, Eocene, thermal maximum. But when it comes to Atlantis, I keep emphasizing to people on these spaces that no, these stories are not as old as you make it out to be. They're not some epic story talking about Gobekli Tepe or something about Native American
Right.
giants and Nephilim. No, the Nephilim are just megaliths. I mean, they're fallen
I I
stones.
I look for patterns and trends, right? Whenever I want to learn about anything. And I love technology, and ancient history technology is just as fascinating as the modern technology that we have now. Now, you're telling me that, well, as per your research, that Atlantis dates back to 900 years before Christ, right?
Or before
What
Solon.
are
Yeah.
so sorry?
Yeah. That's good.
What are what are some of the technologies that they had available at the time? You know, if we could use tech as a hint for, I guess, to date, um, the existence of Atlantis, have they looked into the technologies available in Atlantis to kind of use it as a tool to date, to put a specific date about, the existence of Atlantis itself?
Well, you can. I mean, if you think about like studying certain specific histories of actual technology, like the history of boat making or the history of steel, the history of pottery, all these things, they all have research papers that have a history about this. And we have found that, yeah, steel, the invention of steel, at least small pieces of metal in Cyprus and in Palestine and Egypt, have been found going back to at least 1400 BC. And there's some cases
Mm,
in Africa they found remnants of steel or smelting happening at 2000 BC. So yeah, it definitely there's a chance that we can date Atlantis based off these artifacts to say that we know steel. Most people think steel was invented, earlier or like 1000 BC, but no, it's been used, just not at mass production. Swords were still being made with bronze. Now, Plato gives us a clue, like the word orichalcum. Now, we can linguistically figure out, okay, what technology would that word associate with? There's really only two types of metals. There's there's basically copper and bronze, and he mentions
right.
that there's also a pigment used. So he said this orichalcum was a red pigment, and that is associated with cinnabar, and cinnabar is the ore used for mercury. Now, mercury is interesting because it's very unusual for certain cultures to really deify Mercury or use it for ritual reasons. And we can date when these cultures started extracting Mercury. The Olmecs started using some Mercury, or in the Mayans. So no, the quarries were cinnabar. And for some reason, Plato emphasizes this orichalcum, this red pigment, and cinnabar is used for the painting of walls. In Egypt, red pigment, and also the Minoans and even the Mayans used red pigments. But so knowing when these cultures started using mercury can kind of tell us when Atlantis is, because Plato emphasizes that this metal was very valuable, but it was more valuable because of its color and ritualistic use. So we can date that
I
basically no one was extracting mercury during the hunter-gatherer eras of Gobekli Tepe. No one's ever found any mercury remnants going back 9000 BC. So these are details like someone like, Dan the Debunker, he doesn't address because he plays this victim mentality saying, oh, look, the archaeologists are attacking us. Why are they attacking you? They're attacking you because you're not addressing the evidence. Like Plato says, orichalcum, we can narrow it down. Either it's bronze or it's copper or it's cinnabar. And he says it's used for painting. So that's a very specific detail. And you're like, okay, well, did Egypt have red paint on walls? Apparently they did. They would paint some of the figurines with cinnabar mixed with some other red as well, a mixture of red ochre. But yeah, they would use it. Not as common as we might think though. But yeah, we
Yeah.
can basically say this clue about orichalcum can tell us a date, and it's a technology. Same thing with now when it comes to like modern technology, we can there's so much history on the history of smelting, origins of smelting metal in general. Like we can figure out when that all started happening And it starts with copper, the softest metal, and then Plato also says this land had a lot of gold and silver. So Egypt had a lot of gold, and most of that gold eventually ended up in the Roman Empire. So I'm thinking, okay, well, which culture had a lot of gold near the Greeks? I'm thinking, okay, was it the Persians? Well, they're not old enough. Is it the Hittites? Nah, maybe, but they're not as advanced, and they're not an island. So you narrow it down to these elements.
So, how about geology? In the research that you've done, or in your discoveries that you've made, are there any hints with regards to the geology that could help us understand Atlantis better?
I'm not really a geologist, but I know if Plato says there was a destruction, and we
Hmm.
think that there might be a connection with the Exodus, and that's according to what's this guy's name? There's a researcher named J.G. Bennett in his
Uh-huh.
paper called "New Light on Atlantis and the Exodus." So they're saying that okay, there must be a possible connection with Santorini. Well, okay, if Egypt went through destruction, is there pumice, brimstone, Sodom, Gomorrah, fire and brimstone raining down? Is there pumice in Egypt? And apparently they have found pumice. Some of the pumice they found is like the size of this ruler, and they found it in the ground, and these things were raining down. So in the Nile Delta, they have found evidence of that. Most of it's probably still buried under layers of silt. So we have definitely found pumice in Egypt, and we have found some layer of destruction at Tel El Haman, some correlated to Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's definitely some kind of destruction happening in the regions of Palestine and even the Hittites. There's evidence of some destruction happening there. And there's lots of legends that all point to some destruction happening. And we take the legends in the Middle East more seriously because it's a desert. So when they emphasize fire and then water, okay, I'm thinking a volcano. So a volcano can produce a massive tsunami, and it can cause plants to go, in flames with fire from pumice raining down. Because that
Right.
giant ash cloud, they think that Santorini might have been a volcanic explosion of VEI 6 or 7. If it was 7, that's a massive volcano eruption.
Definitely
And
a
most
lot.
of that ash would move from west to east, right over the Middle East. And the Delta region of Egypt would have been affected. But we can also look for clues in other religions too, to corroborate with this. And the Quran has a different little bit of interpretation on legends of like Saba, Iram, and I think there's another place name, but they talk about there was a dam in the land of Saba, and this dam ruptured and it flooded this garden, this paradise. So there's like
Hmm.
they said there's a river and there's a garden on the right and a garden on the left. So I'm thinking that sounds like the Nile Delta. Now again, more evangelical, if you want to call them that, Muslims take it so literal that they think this is all happening in Saudi Arabia, but no geologist would ever take that seriously. No, this stuff is not happening in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a goddamn desert. Okay, nobody's living in Saudi Arabia at the year 1600 BC. Just a few, scattered people, but the majority of people were living in the safe haven of the Garden of Eden. So the Quran stories about Saba and Iram. Iram is like they call it the city pillars, cities of the pillars, and Egypt has pillars. So I'm thinking these place names shifted to Saudi Arabia over time and got reinterpreted by the locals there and fitted to their local perspective. But they're originally inspired by an older source. And it's been kind of slightly shifted on those stories. Same thing with the idea of the giants. A lot of, Christians want to think there are literal giants. I don't think so anymore. I've looked into that topic. There's something maybe in North America in reference to 7 feet tall people, but there are 7 feet tall people today. They have found unusual tall Native American bones. I don't think it has anything to do with the Bible. But a lot of Christian Americans, they want to think it's all America. It's something to do with America. Like no, these stories are local. They happened in their region. Now it was still a big event. A massive volcano like Santorini would have caused a global cooling for 2 or 3 years and would have caused massive earthquakes. And we see earthquake damage in Egypt. We see it in the Hittites, and we see it in Palestine. So yeah, there's definitely evidence of some real destruction happening. And I don't know why archaeologists don't want to connect the Bronze Age because they think that has to be 1200 BC because most of their margin of errors or most of their artifacts they're dating to that. So something is, I think something has to be wrong. They have to shift those dates towards Santorini, or either Santorini has to be shifted closer. Something is off by a few
I
hundred
understand.
years, but that's
I love your
that
detailed
might change in the
answers.
future. I'm sorry.
I never thought, I love how detailed you are with your answers, Peter. I never thought that we would be having hints in religious scriptures about Atlantis. And I'm sure the same can be applied to other events in history as well, or other points in our history. Uh, Connect tech again. Have you, in your research, found any recent discoveries with regards to Atlantis? Has and my second follow-up question is: has technology, modern tech, how has it helped advance knowledge with regards to discoveries about Atlantis?
Oh yes, like ChatGPT has definitely helped me a little bit until they started putting a paywall and changing the algorithm a little bit. But I started using it early on when ChatGPT first started coming out, and I had a debate with it. And I had screenshotted some of them on my latest videos on Atlantis, the updates from my older videos, because I have updated the hypothesis.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, and ChatGPT, I asked it, I can't remember exactly what I asked, but it was basically about the Garden of Eden. And I first asked, where's the Garden of Eden? Obviously, it gives me a generic answer. It's like nobody knows. There's no consensus. I said, is the Garden of Eden originates from Middle Eastern stories? And it said yes. Okay, then I asked like, which regions in the Middle East are more of an oasis garden? And it mentioned three. They said if there's a Garden of Eden, there are three prime locations. One is Egypt, the second is Mesopotamia, and the third is the Indus Valley. So technically, there are three gardens of Eden. But I said I said, did the Hebrews ever did the Hebrews ever visit the Indus Valley? It said no. Okay, well we know the Hebrew word for Eden, Gan by Eden, is Hebrew in origin. So you keep the law of proximity. And it said it would choose Egypt as the original inspiration, not Babylon, because I asked which of the two Fertile Crescent regions are more fertile, and it said Egypt was because there's more density of vegetation, it's more concentrated in its space, and it has a more sustainable river. Whereas the Tigris and Euphrates are known to dry up and then fill in, flood, and dry up. But the Tigris and Euphrates never formed a delta because it doesn't gain volcanic silt from any volcanoes like the Ethiopian highlands. But Egypt does gain that, so it gains a lot more silt buildup to allow plants to grow. But around Baghdad, they're still trying to irrigate that space, and it's nowhere near as dense as Egypt,
Hmm.
which explains why there's more war happening until Sargon of Akkad came and tried to unify that region in its first empire. And some hypothesize that Sargon may have actually came from Egypt, or at least North African descent, and then he came down the river. And this kind of goes back to so then I asked ChatGPT, like, which civilization invented the sailboat that can go upstream and go against the current? And it was apparently the Egyptians. So they invented a boat, where the sails can go like this and they can force the air, like holding up a seat and pinching it. And now they can start traveling up and downstream, and that gives them a lot of power. And that's the time when Sargon of Akkad unifies Babylon. But Sargon's date is only 1,000, or I'm sorry, 2,200 or 300 BC, but the pyramids were built at least 2,600 to 3,000 BC. So why are we saying that Mesopotamia is the origins of the Garden of Eden? Because there's so much war happening there because of the lack of greenery in space. There was no defined. They were round. They had more city states. So that's where the Persians started inheriting the round cities because each kingdoms in Babylon were trying to protect themselves from each other city state. But in Egypt, they didn't really need that. They actually resorted to rectangular cities, but they're more palace temple complexes. And Egypt had such more defined space that it was able to unify faster than Babylon. But so that's where ChatGPT definitely helped me kind of refine the hypothesis and say, okay, yes, there truly was a literal Garden of Eden, and it's one of these three
Hmm.
spaces. It's either Egypt, Babylon, or Indus Valley. Indus Valley is technically more fertile, but it's so much larger, so it's harder to unify a
Yes.
civilization in a larger space. It takes more time. And the Indus Valley also collapsed. And what's mysterious about the Indus Valley collapse is that's dates around 1700 BC. Santorini is 1600 BC. So I'm thinking,
500-year
okay,
difference.
is there a margin of error for the dates in the Indus Valley that, or is there a margin of error of Santorini? So something might be off, and there was definitely a collapse. And this is where a lot of the white nationalists like to come and say, "See, the Indo-Aryans were the super race." No, no, no. The Indo-Aryans, the Yamnayas, they started migrating south. Well, okay, well, if there's a supermassive volcano, it goes boom, VEI 7. In 2 or 3 years, it causes global cooling. Okay, well, then the agriculture regions in Ukraine are going to die off. It's going to get cold. So they start moving south.
Right.
And we see this in the archaeological record that there's some movement, even in Egypt, with the stories and legends of the sea people. So the sea people may have a connection with Atlantis, but the sea people are not the Atlanteans. They're the ones actually invading Atlantis. But Plato's making it sound like the Atlanteans were invading them. But that's probably some political bias going on there.
Yeah.
But geopolitically, we do definitely see it would make more sense that the Greeks would come down. The Proto Greeks, the Mycenaeans, they were the sea people and they came down. Something was forcing the Indus Valley to go into India, and the Baktria civilization in Turkmenistan, they also collapsed and moved south. So something was moving all these people south, and Egypt records this. And the Jews record it with their story of the Exodus, but they were leaving
Right.
Egypt because there was probably a flood happening in Egypt. So there's definitely something weird that happened in the Middle East. It does have a biblical and Greek legends perspective on it. And the Quran talks about these legends too, but in their own place attachment perspective. So that's why it's more complicated to figure this out. But that's why you can't let the Quran or the Bible dictate history. You should let the archaeological record and historical record
Right.
refine what the Quran and the Bible are saying. Because now we have technology. Now we have ChatGPT.
Right.
You can ask logical questions. Now we have Google Earth. We can literally see a giant garden that looks like a snake of Egypt. In the Bible, there's a snake. Um, so you're thinking, okay, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, and nobody's wants to acknowledge this except for this author, Ralph Ellis. Ralph Ellis is probably he's a secular scholar, well, author, I would say, and not everything he says is correct, especially on Jesus. He's completely off. But when it comes to Garden of Eden, he is dead on. He definitely noticed that there was some movement of monotheism after the date of 1600 BC under Akhenaten. So that's when all these Hebrew stories start popping up. Is after
Gotcha.
that destruction. So that made me start to ask the question, okay, well, what's the details of the destructions? And this author, Gary Greensberg, he actually says that the Bible literally gives us how deep the flood was. And he translated from cubits to feet, and it was about 25 to 30 feet. That's how deep the water was. Now, that is pretty deep if you're covering all of the Nile Delta. Imagine the whole Nile Delta under 30 feet of water. That's
Right.
plausible if there's a giant monsoon happening triggered by the volcano 2 years later, and it flooded the Ethiopian highlands, and a dam ruptured, and it burst into the Nile Valley and flooded everything. Of course, you're going to build a big boat. So Noah's Ark is, was there a person named Noah? Probably not. But there was probably more than one Noah's Ark. And now we can trace the origins of technology of boats. And we know there's only one civilization before the Romans that built big boats to move 400-ton megaliths, and that's Egypt. They had these barge boats, and these barges were like multiple boats put together, and then they put boards across them, and then they would have kind of like a
Right.
canopy. And now most of it's long gone, but we have evidence of this technology transferred to the Romans with Caligula's boats and other boats found in Rome, and they must have adopted technology that they inherited from Egypt, and they were able to build these big treasure boat or these luxury kind of boats, and they're barges basically. So Noah's Ark is described as a barge, and there's only one civilization that really invented the barge, and that was the Egyptians. And more than likely, there was more than one Noah, but he's a symbol of the Exodus, of something happening. So
Right.
people think that, and that's where I connected back to Atlantis. Okay, Plato says in one day and night, Atlantis was flooded and there was a shoal of mud in the way, liquefaction, something happened. And they naturally would have built boats to save their livestock to get out of Egypt, and they landed at the mountains of Ararat, but not where we think today. They would have landed at the Palestinian regions. They went out of Egypt and they would have landed at the foothills of the mountains of Mount Hermon. That was probably the original Mount Ararat. But over time, as Armenian Christians moved up into Armenia, they place named Ararat to their local mountain. But that's not the original mountain. And that's where it's like it's way too high above sea level. And they said they saw water all around, so they must have went out to sea to land in the Palestinian region of ancient Judea. Well, Judea didn't exist at the time, but so that is probably where they're getting the story of a flood. That's the logic people need to start thinking about Genesis. But it's there is historicity in the Quran and the Bible, but you don't need
Right.
to be religious to understand that historicity. You just need to be logical, follow the archaeological record and the history, and question,
They give
maybe
you
some of these
clues.
dates. Yeah, look at the
Right. So you're saying
clues.
that
Yeah,
the religious scriptures, they're stories that give us clues towards
yeah.
the histories, the events that happened in history. Now, speaking of Third Eye Seeks, our common friend here, what are some other things that you both agree on when it comes to Atlantis? You've mentioned several of them, but hearing you both speak about it, there's quite a few things. Can you like share
I
maybe one or
think
two more things you both
we
agree on?
Well, I think we do have more disagreement. I mean, I am challenging Third Eye on
Really?
this. And I think he still thinks there might be evidence of a lost civilization in the really ancient past. And I would have to agree. I've talked to other people in spaces like Rebirth and others, and I'm just telling them that I don't dismiss that like Dr. David Miano might. I would say that I told Dan D. Dunker multiple times that people will take you more seriously if you just separate all these stories about the Garden of or about Atlantis away from the hypothesis of a lost pre-Ice Age civilization.
Right.
Then it's plausible because though we always think that all of our stories have to go back really far in time, but in reality, there's no connection between Gobekli Tepe and anything in the Bible or anything in the Quran. The Quran and the Bible are not talking about Gobekli Tepe. They're just completely separated in time. Even though space-wise they're close, they're too far away that no one's going to remember if you're not writing things down. So an oral tradition only can last for so long until someone starts doing the Chinese whisper game and it just gets all twisted up. But I would agree that there's a plausibility of a lost civilization really far in time, but we shouldn't associate that with Atlantis or the Bible or anything. It's just its own separate thing, like the Pleistocene Eocene thermal maximum hypothesis that maybe there's some weird anthropogenic climate change happening and maybe a civilization caused that. We don't have much evidence yet, but we know something weird caused the blip on the geological record, and his geologists are starting to kind of play with that hypothesis. Well, could there have been a lost civilization? Possible, because at that time entropy would erode a lot of evidence. It would be very
Mm-hmm.
hard to find. But if you're just saying just within the last 12,000 years, no. Okay, a giant megalithic statue of 1,000 tons isn't gonna disappear. Okay, megalithic statues or whatever temples, they're not gonna disappear. Okay, people found it. Um, Even Gobekli Tepe, it's 12,000 years old and we found it, but it's not advanced. It's not a giant fancy temple like what Egypt and Persepolis is.
Right.
So why are we shouldn't be thinking that there's a civilization at the level of Egypt during the Ice Age. We would have found it by now. It wouldn't go hiding. We have billions of people on this planet. Some farmer would have ran across it by now. But if you're talking about deep time, now it gets more blurry. If you're talking about 55 million years ago, now we can start to question. If you're talking about maybe the planet Venus a billion years ago, sure, there's a real possibility there might have been a whole type 1 civilization on Venus a billion years ago. And it's going to be we might find out in about 40 to 50 years from now when they start sending more satellites over there and that sounds like that's the plan. So I can't wait for that. Hopefully, I'm still alive, uh, 50 years from now. But that would be
knock on
interesting
wood.
because that will put things in perspective. And technology is going to reveal that with
A
more
lot of
advanced
things.
satellites that can penetrate and use figure out chemical signatures of Venus and say, what is there evidence of granite, chemical signature of granite on Venus? If there's granite, that means there's water there in the past, because you can't form granite without high pressures of water to fuse it in certain ways.
Understood.
So
You've mentioned
we'll
to me that
see.
you're looking really forward to the future technologies and the discoveries and seeing how it will impact Atlantis as well. I was wondering, you mentioned that you were looking to write a research paper on your
Yeah,
research that.
I think I might, but I think J. Gwen Griffiths already has done most of the work. So the only thing
Mhm.
is he hasn't blatantly said yes, Egypt is 100% Atlantis. Now I see why he hasn't said that, because there's so much influence with the Persians. So there's a conflation between Egypt and Persia. Um, but I might think about it in like my retirement years. I'm working right now, so when I settle down and when in my 50s and 60s, I'll probably consider writing that. But I think for now, it sometimes even if you write a peer reviewed paper, it might not get noticed. Like J. Gwen Griffiths, hardly anybody remembers him. He's from 1930. He wrote a beautiful 24-page essay, and I'm going to use AI 11 Labs to type it up and put a British voice on it because he's British. And I'm going to share some information, and he's going to talk. And I'm going to share that on my channel. And then people can listen to this, so I can actually say, hey, Dr. David Miano, listen to this essay. There really was an Atlantis. Okay, let's actually be rational about this without saying no, Atlantis is all just a bunch of new age white nationalist bullshit. No, there really was an Atlantis, because this Egyptologist and other researchers like George Sarantites, J.G. Bennett, J.M.
The
Allen, and
authors
other
of the two
authors.
books.
So yeah, there's
So,
definitely that's what I'm trying. The only reason I'm putting those videos out on my channel is to share to key people like certain archaeologists and say, hey, think about this. That there really might be Atlantis. But ultimately, I think the truth will people will figure it out, because I think most of the people in the New Age community, they realize that there's something about Egypt that is off. It just stands out. It's very unusual, and some destruction actually happened. And on HBO Max, there's a show called not Ancient Apocalypse, Ancient Armageddon, um,
mhm,
that is more mainstream, but they acknowledge that there's some destruction that happened in Egypt. They see earthquake damage, they see water erosion. So they think that, yeah, maybe we should rethink that the Bronze Age collapse was caused by some catastrophe, and it had probably something to do with a volcano and not an asteroid, as Randall Carlson wants to theorize. So I think there is a shift definitely happening, even with mainstream archaeologists. Like, okay, there really is a lot of evidence of destruction, and we don't think it's all human cause. We actually think it maybe actually might be actual earthquake damage, and it caused some collapse. And they know that during the Bronze Age collapse, that there was like a period of 300 years where nothing was happening, and the only civilization that was recovering faster was Egypt. Because, of course, the Atlanteans, Egypt would recover faster because they're more advanced. So, the logic that an advanced civilization would just be 100% completely wiped out makes no logical sense. So, of course, it would be the Atlanteans that would recover from this disaster faster than any other civilization, and that was Egypt. And under Ramses the second, I think it was, or the first. So under Ramses, yeah, Ramses second, there was a lot of reconstruction happening. So it makes no sense in the Bible. They keep saying Ramses was a tyrant and all that, but in reality, he was a reconstruction guy. He was rebuilding Atlantis. So I don't think Ramses is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Either that, or we're missing a few Ramses. That's a possibility. There must be another pharaoh. Then I think that's what to the story of the destruction, the exodus out of Egypt, that connects with Atlantis, I think. So we'll wait and see, but I think this might change in the future in mainstream archaeology. That
Now, I was just wondering, what does the future hold for you, Peter?
well, I'm kind of dying down on YouTube, so I'm not gonna be posting too many videos. I'm just gonna get the
Oh,
hypothesis of
unfortunate.
Atlantis and Egypt out there because no one else has done it. Um, there's a few that mention J. Gwen Griffiths essay, but I
Mhm.
have not found a single video that has anybody uploading his essay. So I think I'm going to upload one more video to put his full 24 pages essay. You have to dig a little deeper if you really want to solve a certain mystery. Whether it's mystery about Jesus or Muhammad or Atlantis or whatever, or Buddha, it's a complicated thing, and I recommend checking out channels like Religion for Breakfast. He's a great researcher. Esoterica is another channel, great researcher, a professor, and another guy named Let's Talk Religion. And I think he's a Muslim scholar. Amazing channels, and they are. So I would like to we should reach out to those people and say, hey, have you ever heard about the Egypt hypothesis on Atlantis? Maybe look into it. No woo woo. Just look into it.
Well, thank you for your time. I'm going to make sure to get all the links for your X profile, if that's okay with you, your YouTube channel, the books that you were referencing, as well as the names of the channels that you were recommending our viewers a few seconds ago.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Netta.
Well, thank you, Peter, for your time. I appreciate it. It was quite insightful. I learned a lot from you today. And I'll see you on X. And
Yeah.
hopefully someday we can get our friend Thonai to join us for a discussion. All three of us,
Yeah. Good.
hopefully. All right. Well, thanks again for your time. I hope you have a beautiful day.
All right. Thanks, Netta.
And to all the viewers, thank you so much for listening. And I hope that you gained some knowledge and some wisdom from this podcast episode of Come Say Hi. Take good care. Till next time. Bye bye.